Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for one of our last Human and Wildlife Interaction Speaker Series seminars. This week, we're talking about grizzlies and wolves and their presence on the landscape here in Wyoming. And we've got Luke Ellsbury to speak with us about that. Next week, we have David Howe talking about the domestication of the dog, and that's kind of our kickoff to Archaeology Awareness Month, which is September in Wyoming. And we've also got a project going all throughout September measuring the skulls of bison. So if you have a skull of a bison that was found in Bighorn Basin, bring it by the museum, we'll measure it, and then we'll let you know how it compares to other bison. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Luke. And we can go ahead and get started.
Well, hopefully I'm doing this right. Well, thanks everybody for having me. And we'll get started with this. So can you guys hear me okay, Amy?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay, perfect. So I'm Luke Ellsbury. I'm the large carnivore biologist here in the Cody region for the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. And the main focus of my work is actually large carnivore and human interactions and conflicts. But through this, we're gonna go through a little bit of biology, a little bit of population dynamics, and then we'll talk about some interaction stuff too. So hopefully I don't bore you to death, and everybody learns a little bit something out of this. And so we'll get started. So the grizzly that's found in Wyoming, its Latin name is Ursus arctos horribilis, and that's a subspecies of Ursus arctos, and there's several found throughout the northern hemisphere, all the way from North America, Europe, and Asia. It is an opportunistic omnivore. And one interesting thing about the bears we have here in the Yellowstone ecosystem is they consume a really wide variety of plants and animals that we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's over 260 different species of plant and animal, which is pretty interesting. They aren't territorial at all, not like wolves or mountain lions, any of that. They will defend food, personal space, and young, which we'll talk about later. But as far as a territory, they do have a home range, but they don't actively defend it from other bears. They are crepuscular, so they are active at dusk and dawn, really highly active at dusk and dawn. They're also nocturnal, and they spend a big portion of their time at night. A thing about bears that's really neat is they are highly adaptable. So you find them all the way from really high alpine areas of Wyoming all the way down into the deserts of the basin, and they do a very good job of living in all that system in between. The only other bear that you find in Wyoming is the black bear, and there's four pretty good ways to tell the two apart. Grizzly bears have this prominent shoulder hump that you can see there. They also have a dished face profile, and then they have short rounded ears compared to their face. And actually with black bears, the ears are actually about the same size. However, grizzlies end up having a much wider and broader face, which makes their ears look smaller. Their claws are also quite a bit longer than in black bears. They're 2 to 4 inches typically, but you look at a black bear's claws, they're 2.5 inches or shorter. So the grizzly bear's claws are long and straight, and they're adapted for digging, where you look at a black bear's and they're more rounded or curved, which are more adapted for climbing. If you look at these black bears, they have a pretty straight face profile along here, no prominent shoulder hump. They, in relation to their face, their ears look more taller and point, have a little more point to them, and then those shorter claws. However, if color and size can be pretty misleading. Those are the two ways we don't use to tell bears apart. If you look at this bear on the left, you look at that dark color. He's got kind of those taller looking ears. That's actually a grizzly bear out of British Columbia. You look at the bear on the right and you look at the coloring with those dark legs and that grizzled back. That's actually a black bear here out of Cody that we got pictures of earlier in the year. So a little bit of reproductive biology. Grizzly bears do sexually mature at about 4 to 6 years old on average. We did have a bear in the park this year. It was a known 2-year-old male that did try reproducing with some females early in the year. I don't know if he was successful or not, but on average, it's usually 4 to 6 years before they begin their breeding process. The main breeding season is in May or June, although they do at times breed later in the year, and both sexes are polygamous. So one female that has 2 or 3 cubs, those cubs may be sired all by different males. And one interesting thing with them is they are delayed implanters. And so once they breed, that embryo will begin to form and then it goes dormant. And it won't actually implant onto the uterine wall until they go to den in, probably late October, early November. The cubs are then born in January, early February, and they're very, very small, and maybe just a couple pounds. But they have 3 to 4 months to grow within the female or grow within the den. And by the time they emerge from the den in late April or early May, they're actually able to keep up with the female pretty good. The average litter size is 2 cubs, although 3 is not uncommon, and we have started to find litters of 4 cubs pretty often now. The cubs will remain with the mother for 2.5 years, or basically 2 denning cycles, which is different from black bears. Most black bear cubs only remain with their mother for 1 denning cycle or 1.5 years, and then they leave. Whoops, sorry. So they do eat a wide variety of animals. It usually starts in the spring when they emerge from the den, and they end up eating carrion or winter killed elk or deer. And then that moves into grasses and forbs that are coming up early. That later moves on to neonates or young of the year of ungulates. And so we see bears really pull off of grass and forbs once elk start having their calves. And they'll use those basically from the time they hit to the ground till July 1st or so. From there, they move up to high elevation. And one thing that's really unique with what we have in this ecosystem is the army cutworm moth. And so army cutworm moths come from basically the Midwest, Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, the Dakotas, and they migrate to the high elevations here in Wyoming. And they'll live in the talus slopes that are above 10,000 feet, basically between 10,000 and 12,000 feet. And bears move up to that elevation and they begin eating on them. And it's pretty neat because those bears will eat 20,000 to 50,000 moths a day. And in the next slide, I'll show you when we get there, but it's actually the highest caloric intake those bears have during their entire year. From there, they move on to berries, and we have a wide variety of berries here in the ecosystem. On this side of the divide, it's mainly choke cherries that'll hold them over, although we have thimbleberries, strawberries, raspberries, that sort of thing. But the main thing we see them eat is choke cherries. From there, they move on to white bark pine, and white bark pine is a pretty neat tree. It grows at very high elevations. It does not produce cones every year. We have boom and bust years with it. And so when it's available to bears really varies. And so those cones are actually harvested by squirrels and put into caches by the squirrels. And then the bears come up and dig those up behind We have other things like Clark's nutcracker and other things that'll harvest those too. But it can be a really important source, but it's not always available, and not every bear uses it either. As we move into the fall, we have hunter harvested carcasses that really become important for bears, and actually turns into a big source of conflict with bears as well. But there's something near 2,000 tons of biomass are put on the landscape every year during hunting season. And so that's a big caloric intake that those bears have coming into that hibernation season. I guess, and another thing I forgot to talk about was the trout run. So early in the spring, cutthroat trout and rainbow trout will both run, especially on the North Fork. We see bears using them in the upper drainages, especially in like Newton Creek, Eagle Creek, some of that. In the thoroughfare country, we got cutthroat coming out of the Yellowstone Lake that'll run up in that. And that does become a pretty important food source. In the past, that has diminished a little bit due to lake trout in the lake. But through efforts from Yellowstone National Park and others, we've seen that run start to come back, and that's beginning to be utilized again. If we look at some of the caloric intake, this becomes pretty important for bears. And of course, everybody knows bears are driven by their nose and their stomach. But if we look at just what they're getting out of each thing they eat, you look at army cutworm moths, and it's almost 8 kcals per gram. You look at vertebrates or carrion that they're picking up, it's about 6 kcals. And you work down to white bark pine, which is everybody looks at as the really important food they need to have. It's actually about half of what moths get. So you guys down in Matitsi that have been up to Frank's Peak or Carter Mountain and watched all those bears that congregate there in the summer, that's why they're there, is basically that's the highest caloric value that they can get within the ecosystem. So if we look at the historic distribution of bears, pre-European settlement, they actually inhabited about the western half of the continent, all the way from central Mexico all the way to the tip of Alaska. There's actually recently, in the last couple of years, a grizzly bear skull found in a river embankment in Kansas. So they did make it to the Midwestern states. There's historical evidence that they were in the Dakotas, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, some of that. And then they moved westward through the Rocky Mountains all the way to the West Coast. By 1922, that was pretty fragmented. You see these island populations all the way down through the West in what we have in the Western United States. And then by the time of their listing in 1975, the only 2 major populations left were here in the Yellowstone ecosystem, and then at what we call the Northern Continental Divide system up around Glacier National Park. So before I start into kind of some of the population stuff for Wyoming, there's a couple terms you guys need to know. One of them is the primary conservation area, and that's the red line you see on that map. And that's what we consider the core habitat. That's where habitat and management standards do apply and will apply if they are ever delisted. And that's where we want to keep the core, the breeding population up. And that's about 9,200 square miles. Outside of that is the black line, and that's what we call the demographic monitoring area, or the DMA. And if you've talked much about grizzly bears with other folks around, the DMA has been the big source of discussion within management on grizzly bears. This is what we consider suitable habitat for grizzly bears. And there's different ways you can look at suitable habitat. And there's the biologically suitable and the socially suitable habitat for grizzly bears. I'm pretty well convinced that there is nothing that's not biologically suitable for grizzly bears. They can make a living about everywhere. But when it comes to the social suitability of where we can have grizzly bears, that's really where this line applies. And so if you look at this, and we'll look at this slide again a little bit later, but you look at the distribution and how that's grown outside of where we we determine that it's biologically suitable or socially suitable for grizzly bears, we're actually quite a ways outside that line. If we look in 1980, the distribution of grizzly bears, and this is only 5 years after they were listed on the endangered species list, and it was mainly within that primary conservation area or the recovery zone, which is that yellow line. We were getting a few sightings outside of what we deemed as distribution, but for the most part, they were within Yellowstone National Park or in that Sunlight Crandall area in North Dakota there. If we get to 1990, we look and pretty much the whole conservation area is filled up. And we're starting to see that spill out of bears. And it's pretty interesting because this isn't very far from when the first talks about delisting grizzly bears happened. They were starting to get out of that conservation area. We were seeing them spill out into random sightings a little ways outside of there. And people really started talking about delisting then. We moved that to 2000, and now we're really spilled out. We're seeing them on the edge of Cody, on the edge of Meeteetse, down through the Owl Creeks, and they're starting to make their way into that Upper Green area on the Northern Wind River Range, and then again in Montana and Idaho. By 2014, we've really spilled outside. Now we've got bears in the Bighorn Basin. We've seen them on Hart Mountain. We've seen them out towards Burlington. We're starting to get them way down the Owl Creeks, the Wind River Range, the Wyoming Range. And so we're starting to see that exponential climb of the population really hit and seeing the effects of that. So by 2016, we see, so this blue line is the demographic monitoring area. And keep in mind, that's where we actively look for bears and that's where we count bears. And it's interesting because if you guys hear that term or hear the population estimate, all these bears that are outside of that blue line are not a part of that estimate, actually. So people get upset when we say there's only 720 bears. However, we're not counting those outside either. And so we see that distribution has increased by 11% just in 2 years. So we're still on that exponential climb, and I think we still are today as well. We look at the density. So as the population grows, we may have a bigger distribution of bears, but we actually don't have an even density across that distribution. So if you look in 1983, that top left corner map, the heaviest density was really within the park. By 1983, we still had a heavy density within the park, although higher densities were spilling out through that Crandall area, the North Fork, South Fork, and then starting to touch that Graybull River area. By 2003, the heaviest densities start to get seen outside the park. So same areas, that Sunlight Crandall, North Fork, South Fork, along the Du Bois country, and then in the Graybull too. By 2012, we have certain hot spots within. So you look at actually the South Fork is not as quite as dense as some of those other areas around the Owl Creeks, North Fork, Sunlight Crandall, and then within the park really is starting to get dense now. If we look at today, current estimates put the Yellowstone population at about 728 individuals, and that was last year. And it's been hovering right between 760 and 720 for a lot of years now. And that is based on a population that's modeled over unique sightings of female with cubs, and mainly cubs of the year. And so the hard part with that is there's only so many sightings we can fit in the way the population is modeled now. So if I see a female with 2 cubs of the year in a spot, and then I see another female with 2 cubs of the year in the spot, they're within a modeled buffer, you'd say, then one of those sightings actually gets thrown out, even if they're the same, or if they're different females. And so it's really hard to get above that 700 number. So we may actually be above that 1,000 individuals within the demographic monitoring area. However, our model may not let us get there. And there is some discussion and some some work being done about that. We do know the population is continuing to expand, and it's going to expand beyond the boundaries of where the population is monitored. And with that, it comes more of a chance of human interaction and conflict. And that's where my job comes into play. We have to look at this as a success story. It really is. And within North America, there's very few animals, or at least very few animals that are studied like this one. This is a slow reproducing animal. It's actually the second slowest reproducing animal in North America, next to muskox. And so bringing this back was a conservation success story. However, with that rebound comes a lot of opportunity for human conflicts within that, or interactions with that within that. And we are seeing that with all carnivores within the Western United States. Mountain lions are rebounding to the point where they're being seen in the Eastern United States again. Wolves, of course, are rebounding, which we'll talk about. This is kind of a West-wide phenomenon. So conflicts, and this is, if any of you guys have had a bear in your trash, or a bear killing cattle, or anything like that, you've probably met either myself or somebody from my crew, and this is where we come in. And basically within Wyoming, it's defined as interactions between humans and large carnivores that result in property damage, agricultural damage, animal or human death or injury. And so that's either an animal that's killed or injured in an encounter with a human, or a human that's encountered or is injured or killed with an encounter with an animal. And that's pretty much the short version of it. It is an expanding front line when it comes to conflict management, and it's a struggle we look at right now because we have a larger footprint every year for the response to these conflicts, and also to the education. Is we encounter folks all the time that have never had to deal with this, and a lot of long-term residents that have never had to deal with it. And as you guys know, we have a lot of new residents moving in the area into old areas that have been secure, but now aren't, because people aren't educated or just aren't aware of the danger of having bears or carnivores on the landscape with them. And so it turns into a big process. If we look at human bear conflicts, it kind of trends right with how the population has expanded. If you look at the conflicts through 1990, you see most of them are within that primary conservation area. And that makes sense, because that's where we had the most bears. We were still trying to work out our conservation message, trying to figure out how to deal with conflicts with bears. And of course, you always have the holdouts of, why should I do something different, or why do I need to deal with this when you guys are here? So we see a lot of that happening through the 90s. We get to 2000, and we are still getting a few conflicts within that conservation area. However, we start seeing them spill out into what we would call the demographic monitoring area now. The Cody Front, especially along the lower South Fork, the lower North Fork, the lower Grable River. And then if you look way to the south in the Wind Rivers, that's when we start seeing cattle depredation start in the upper Green River cattle allotments. We moved through 2010, and we started seeing a lot of those conflicts spill out of the DMA. And so now we're seeing conflicts along the Front Range, outside of monitoring areas, outside areas where we expected grizzly bears to be, as well as filling up outside of that PCA, or primary conservation area. By 2015, most of our conflicts are really building up alongside that Front Range, as well as down south through that upper Green River, the Dubois area. The Owl Creek area is really flared up now. We're starting to see a lot more livestock conflict down through there. And so it's really increased our efforts into who are we speaking to and where are our educational efforts going. If we look at the Cody example, from 2004 to 2009, only 24% or about a quarter of our conflicts were outside of that DMA. So outside of that black line where we actively monitor and manage for bears. And you see, that's kind of this stuff, that lower South Fork, north of town, we get some cattle depredation, and then the Clark area. And then it doesn't really show here, but we'll start to see kind of that southern edge of that map. That'll build on cattle depredation after 2009 there. If we look now, 53% of our conflicts occur outside the DMA. And so over half by 2015, and that has grown again now by 2020. I just didn't have the map to show it. But again, Clark area, all the way north of Cody, that lower South Fork, and then again along Matitsi, we're starting to see that Grable River stuff fill in. You guys out of Matitsi are starting to see grizzly bears really close to town. In fact, I verified one right across the river from town that was called about a month ago. And so it's just a continuing trend, moving further out in the basin and growing in number. And then at the very southern end of the map, you see that Owl Creek country out of Thermopolis, where that livestock interaction is really building quite a bit. We look at last year, which wasn't a bad year for us, and this year isn't shaping up to be a bad year either. But cattle tend to be our number one conflict with grizzly bears in this area, or well, within the state really. 65% of all of our conflict last year was from cattle damage, and that's 126 calves or cows that were killed. Next is garbage, pet, bird seed, livestock feed, and property damage. And the interesting thing about those three right there is, even though they sit at second, third, and fourth, those actually have been cut in about half from what they were in the early 2000s and the 90s. So that's where we saw our educational efforts start to pay off, where, if we would have been at the levels or at the percentages we were then, those would have been way higher. And so that's where we see residents starting to buy in, starting to learn how to live with bears, how to avoid having encounters with them. And most of that actually is coming from people that have never had to deal with grizzly bears before. And so that they're learning how, and this is their process. You can't fault them that much for that. You look at, we have very little sheep, poultry, animal death would have been animals killed within probably self-defense. Unsecured attractants is a wide variety of things, but you see that's not very high either. Aggression towards human is going down. So people are learning to live with bears. The only reason we have high conflicts mainly is becoming a livestock deal. And part of that is just we have bears that have always had a pretty high percentage of meat in their diet compared to other populations. If we look at that through time, you see from 2009 to 2019, we did have some spikes. 2010 and 2015 were both pretty good spikes within that conflict zone. And those were both natural food failure years. And we saw a lot of bears fall to the valley floors, living around people, subdivisions, around ranch sites. And so those conflicts went way up. And again, a lot of those were livestock conflicts. However, if you look at the long-term trend in the last 10 years, we are still trending upward with conflicts. And that's a function of more bears in more places. And until we can figure out ways to curb conflicts or get ahead of them in certain instances, or get ahead of it with educational experiences, then it probably will continue to trend up. And that's one reason we started several years ago, Bearwise Wyoming, and it was started with Mark Brasino, and there's been several coordinators over the last few years, although Dusty Lassiter runs it up now, and he's been there for several years now. And so we started looking at ways, how do we approach people? How do we get in with these communities, and how do we start keeping people safe? And we do that through infrastructure, educational experiences, and then things like Dusty here with this dead cow, a carcass management program, where if you do have a carcass of live, a horse or a cow dies within grizzly bear habitat, we have a free program where we'll come pick that up. We do other things, electric fencing. Some of you guys in Matiti may have seen a lot of permanent electric fences going in around beehives in your area this year. And that was in response to some of this bear damage that's going on, and just ways to make that lessen. And so the main focuses of Bearwise Wyoming are to maximize human safety, discourage bears from residential areas, which is becoming an increasing thing we have, minimize property damage, which we have seen, minimize livestock losses, which we're still working on, minimize human interactions with bears, and minimize human-caused bear mortality. And you know, I should say that not all human interactions with bears are bad. You know, if you see a bear a couple hundred yards away when you're driving down the road and take pictures of it, that's a great interaction. If you see one while you're hiking and it moves off the other way and there's no conflict, I mean, that can be a great interaction. But with grizzly bears, there is a lot of negative interactions as well. We do several educational efforts statewide. With the large carnivore section within the Game and Fish, we do approximately 75 presentations every year, and those are usually geared towards safety or biology. If we look at schools, we do elementary, middle school, high school, college, and the message does vary by the school. A lot of elementary schools is biology and safety. Middle school will move more deeper into it, and then by college, we're actually trying to present on the management end of it, along with the ecology and safety, and just trying to get that next generation ready to deal with some of the issues that come up with having carnivores on the landscape. We do also do presentations with clubs, ranches, professional organizations. We try and do at least one bear safety hunter education, or with every hunter education class, I guess we do a bear safety with every one. And then we do present to county commissions and that sort of thing as well. We do radio PSAs, newspaper ads, press releases, and then within Jackson, we've done these signs within restrooms and on buses there, just to try and curb some of that garbage conflict that's going on there. But a lot of this is revolved around, of course, hunting season and some of those times a year when conflict is going to be at its highest. We also have conflict prevention, and that's a lot of removing attractants such as that carcass management program, or if somebody wants to get rid of an apple tree, we'll remove an apple tree for them. We also secure attractants, and mainly through electric fence, or like this middle picture, putting in locks on a grain shed so that a bear can't pop it open. We do aversive conditionings with animals that are near subdivisions or getting habituated to certain home sites. And then also giveaways such as bear spray that we do every fall in Cody and Jackson for hunters, just trying to get more bear spray in the hands of people that could use it, especially, hunters and fishermen that don't typically carry it. So if we look at some of the human and bear interactions that we typically see, I'll go through some of the safety stuff here. Hopefully you guys never find yourself darting a bear and having to run away from it. Luckily, I never have yet, but getting close to a bear roadside, or having a bear peek through your window, or just generally running into a bear, we'll just give you a few tips to look at that and how to react through that. So preventing close encounters, and like I said before, not every interaction with a bear or any large carnivore is negative. I've had plenty of really positive interactions with all of the large carnivores that I really love. But I'm going to go through kind of how to react when you do have a negative interaction with them. And these start off as just kind of some ways to prevent close encounters. And one of them is don't recreate alone. One thing we tell people is hike in groups of 4 or more. Bears tend to be a little bit more intimidated by larger groups. If you're in a pair or 3 people, that's great. It's better to have more than none with you. Stay on main trails, and everybody likes to do a little bushwhacking and getting off the trail every now and then. I guess my recommendation would be is do it where you can see. Bears travel the same trails we do, and a lot of times when they get off the trail, they get off in thick timber along a creek bottom or somewhere that they can go and dig a day bed that they can get out of that day's heat and stay a little bit cooler. And that's the areas that you're most likely going to run into a bear at close quarters. Avoid hiking at dusk and dawn. And again, because they're crepuscular, that's the time of day they like to travel. They're highly active. They're feeding, especially this time of year, feeding in choke cherries or on carcasses. And so that's where you're going to run into them at that time of day. Make noise to alert a bear of your presence, especially along creek bottoms, or if you see tracks in the trail heading the same way you're heading, it might be a good idea to just talk and make a little bit of noise. And then I realize that these are all things that hunters don't do, but I guess if you're just the average user out hiking, this is a good way to avoid being bear, or a good way to be bear aware. Be alert, avoid areas where seasonal food sources are available. And one thing, is if you look at scat piles, it usually tell you what a bear is eating. So if you look at this lower left scat pile here, that's actually grass. That's a bear eating grass, grazing. So it'll give you an idea that if you're walking through an open meadow, that might be a spot that you want to look for that bear. On the lower right, that's actually a choke cherry scat. And so you see the pits and whatnot in there that would give you the idea that they're in choke cherries, and just educating yourself about what they eat at what time of year is just a good idea if you're going to recreate in bear country. So look at for scat tracks, rolled rocks, and then they do like to dig forbs and that sort of thing. So if you see a lot of potholes dug in a meadow or in a field you're walking through, that's a good sign that they're probably either digging up gophers or roots. Now, in most cases, bears do avoid people. Probably 99% of those encounters end up with that bear leaving the area. There's 2 situations when bears do not avoid people, and I'm going to talk about one of them through the bears, the aggressive defensive behavior. And then we'll get to the predatory behavior once I get to wolves, just because it's pretty universal on how you react with that. But with aggressive defensive behavior, grizzlies are usually defending something, or they're trying to break off what they see as a threat. If we look at that, there's basically 3 things that they're trying to protect. And most of you guys that recreate in grizzly bear country know that the worst thing you can run into in the fall usually is a female with young, and they do protect their young, and they're pretty aggressive about it, protecting those young cubs. The next thing they protect is their personal space. So just like us, they all have their personal bubble, and it varies between bear to bear. And some bears will allow you to get very close, like bears in the park. That Yellowstone has a policy where they allow people to get certain distance from a bear. Outside the park, we don't tolerate it very much. And so it can vary depending where you're at. And then also protecting a food source. And especially as we come into the fall, those bears get very aggressive around certain food sources. As we get into mid-September and October, you'll see them guarding carcasses a lot. And that's where a lot of hunters get into a bind with bears. If you leave your carcass out overnight, then you should expect there to probably be a bear guarding it there in the morning. The few things you want to do if you do run into a bear in close quarters is you want to assess that bear's behavior. You want to watch its head and body movements, and you want to make a plan. And usually I tell people it's a bad time to make a plan when you're in the middle of it, because it happens so fast. One thing I can tell you is it's something, if you know you're going to be in the outdoors and you're going to be recreating in bear country, it's something you should think about long before you ever get there. There's lots of good literature out there about how to deal with these things. And actually, the Park County Library has a video there, living in bear country, that Dusty has put on loan with them. It's a little bit outdated and a little bit dry, but it does show a lot of these bears showing stress behaviors. And I would recommend you guys check that out, or any of the books that are out there. But one thing they do is they will pace back and forth, and they will pant while they're swinging their head. And a lot of times they swing their head low when they're really aggravated. And then that materializes into vocalizations such as a moan or a huff. They'll sort of, or they'll woof. And then they'll pop their jaws as that escalates further. And so you hear something that just kind of sounds like a jaw popping. It's a kind of a cross between a pop and a crack, I guess. They do tend to drool a lot when they're stressed out, and they tend to yawn a lot. So if you see them yawning and sticking their tongue way out, that's a really sure sign that they're aggravated and they're stressed out. And then that culminates into a bluff charge or a full-on charge. And we'll talk about both of those here on these next couple of slides. But you want to be able to recognize and see those stress behaviors and how they build in that bear as you interact with them. So what to do in a close encounter? And the first thing, and it's with any large carnivore, is you want to stay calm and try and back out slowly. And honestly, 99% of the time you will be able to back out slowly. They'll probably know you're there, but they're not really that worried about it. Do avoid direct eye contact. In the bear world, that's defensive posturing. When you're staring them down and they're staring you down, they basically know you're asking them for a fight. So look at the ground below them, or look below you where you can see them out of your periphery, but do not make direct eye contact with them. Again, don't run, and speak in a soft monotone. So it's, hey bear, hey, I'm here, bear. Don't try and yell violently or scream at them. A lot of times that actually can trigger an attack. If you are charged, stand your ground, especially if it's a bluff. I know that's really easy said, but rather than done, because I've been there. It's a really hard thing to stand your ground, but it's actually the safest thing you can do if they're not going to make contact with you. And if you do, I should add, if you do have bear spray with you, if they're bluff charging, it's a great time to use it, or any defense you have. If they are going to make contact and you don't have a defense on you, you need to drop to the ground, especially if they do make contact with you. Drop to the ground and lay on your stomach with your legs slightly apart so that you're harder to roll over. And then you want to put your fingers kind of interlocked and behind your neck. And mainly that's because bears tend to go for your head and neck just naturally. We look at a lot of big adult males that fight through breeding season, and almost all of them are bit on the head and neck. It's just the natural place where they go during a defensive fight. If you have a pack on, leave your pack on. I mean, it's great. It covers your back. That's another spot that bears love to bite. So leave your pack on. It's just something to protect you. And at all costs, don't fight back. Fighting back usually makes the attack worse, and it prolongs it. So if they get you flipped over onto your back, just immediately roll back over onto your stomach and spread your legs again, and just keep doing that until they leave, and give them some time to leave, because they're as worked up as you are through this whole thing. And a lot of attacks, defensive attacks we see when we go to investigate, those bears are long gone before we even get there. I mean, they're ready to clear country. So bear spray it's a tool for the toolbox, I guess. It is a personal defense mechanism, and that can be used on aggressive bears. It can be used on a lot of aggressive wildlife, really. And that's because it contains capsaicin, or the hot stuff in peppers. So if you've ever cut up peppers and rubbed your eyes or your nose and it burns really bad, it's the same thing that's in the bear spray, just a lot stronger. And it does affect the mucous membrane. So basically those eyes, nose, and mouth, and it attaches to it, and it's a long lasting effect. Actually, I got bucked off a horse last year and exploded a can of bear spray all over me, and ended up having to ride for another 3 or 4 hours. And it was one of the most unpleasant experiences I've ever had. But anyway, it sprays out about 25, 30 feet, and it makes about a 4-foot diameter cloud. So it's a pretty big cloud that they've got to get through to get to you. Each can is about 7 seconds in duration, although I wouldn't recommend just dumping your whole can in an episode with a bear. 1 or 2 seconds should do the trick, and then you've got some left in case you need it. You do want to check the expiration dates on these, and it's not because bear spray goes bad. It's because the rubber seal on the top of it actually will compress and expand with heat and cold, and it lets the propellant out. And so after that expiration date, there's a chance that it'll probably still work, but it may not shoot near as far or shoot at all if all the propellant is leaked out. It is registered with the EPA as well. And again, limitations are it does burn if you get it on you, and I can tell you it burns really bad. And it is affected by wind and rain. So even in pretty good winds, it'll shoot out in front of you, but it won't shoot as far. And then same with rain. Rain tends to dissipate it out of the air as you use it. The other thing I should talk about is firearms. And it's another toolbox or tool for the toolbox. And grizzly bears may be killed in protection of human life in Wyoming, but not in protection of property or private property. So not in protection of your shed, your livestock, your pets, any of that. And that's through the federal government. All those, if you do kill a grizzly bear, it must be reported to the Game and Fish, and we do investigate it. And that's just common practice. I don't know that there's ever been one self-defense case in Wyoming investigated that's been actually prosecuted. Well, maybe one that was a little questionable, but for the most part, it's not a big deal. The pros of it is it's unaffected by wind or bad weather. Bullet goes through a lot of different stuff, but the cons are it is lethal to bears, and we do in some respects want to keep some bears on the landscape, and we don't want guys to have to go through that whole investigation process. But it also can't be used really quickly or accurately by most people. They just take a ton of practice, and during those, not many people have practice under high stress conditions to be able to use them. The biggest thing you can do is just be prepared. Take the time to think about what you need before you leave, and think about what you would do in an encounter before you even get to the mountains. Like I said, there's a lot of literature out there. There's a lot of time to think when you're sitting in your house on COVID and nothing else to do. So, just prepare yourself before you even actually get to the mountains. So with that, I'll kind of break into wolves here a little bit, and this won't be quite as long. It's a pretty touchy subject with a lot of people in Wyoming, but it's worth talking about, and they are actually pretty neat critters when you get to work around them. So they are Canis lupus. These guys differ from bears as they are obligate carnivores. They are very territorial, and then they're also pack animals. So unlike bears, these guys are not solitary. They live within packs, and they are very social within those packs. The one animal we have in Wyoming that somewhat closely resembles a wolf is the coyote. However, wolves tend to be quite a bit bigger, and they come in a lot more variety of colors. You look at the length of a wolf is up to about 6.5 feet compared to 4.5 feet with coyotes. They stand, 32 inches at the shoulder, where coyotes are about 20. The weight, I do need to update this. Average they're 60 to about 120 pounds. We have had wolves in Wyoming that are in that 150 to 160 range, but it's pretty rare. When we look at coyotes, they're in that 20 to 50 pounds. And like I said, wolves come in a wide variety. They're gray, black, blue, black and gray, white. I mean, they're all over the board. Most coyotes, almost every coyote you'll see will be gray or reddish brown with rusty legs. Their ears on wolves are, they're rounded and relatively short compared to their head. And that's because their head tends to be a lot more broad, bigger than a coyote's. Coyotes do have big pointy ears for listening. And you ever seen a coyote hunt mice in the snow in the winter? That's where those big ears play in. They do have a big, large, blocky muzzle compared to a coyote that tends to be smaller and more petite. If you look at their tracks, wolves if you guys have ever seen a Mastiff or a Great Dane, that's pretty close to getting to what a wolf track is compared to your average dog. A coyote track is, similar to that or smaller. This picture shows this black wolf in the foreground with the coyote in the background, and you just kind of see that more blocky nature, thicker built wolf than compared to that coyote that's just a little bit more dainty. So with the reproduction in wolves, there is only one breeding pair within a pack in general. There's an alpha male and an alpha female, and they're the only ones that'll produce pups within that pack. I was actually just told a week or two ago that there's a pack within the park that had 4 breeding pairs within one pack, which I've never heard of in my life, but it was pretty interesting. And that'll be a pretty interesting case study to see what happens with them in the future. But they do breed in February, and then they have their pups in April. So just like your dogs, they have around a 60-day gestation period. The average litter size is 4 to 6, and they are born in a den, and they will stay in that den for a couple months. And then those wolves move them out to what we call rendezvous sites. So you can imagine if any of you guys have raised puppies, they make a big mess. So within a couple of months, those pups have pretty much trashed out those den sites. And they'll start moving them from rendezvous site to rendezvous site, which act as a den site, but without the den. The pups stay there and the adults go out and hunt, and then they rendezvous basically back at that site. Within 6 to 8 months, they'll start hunting with the pack. And so by mid to late fall, they're traveling with the pack, they're running with them. And then by 2 to 3 years old, they'll begin to disperse out. And that does depend on the food density and the breeding status. Some members of the pack stay there their whole lives, and other ones they'll leave. And if they're unsuccessful with finding a mate, then they'll come back later in the year and join the pack again through the winter or through the summer. And so one example of that is this was a collared wolf that was collared north of Yellowstone in 2008. And she made quite the journey. And this was over the course of 1 year. And you see her come out of Montana, down through the park, ends up around Cody, spends a bunch of time around Cody, down through the South Fork, the Grable, the Owl Creeks, down into the Wind Rivers, spends a bunch of time in the Wind Rivers, down in the Wyoming Range, bunch of time in the Wyoming Range, Idaho, Utah, Colorado, back into Wyoming, back into Colorado, and then was actually eventually, I think, poisoned accidentally there in Colorado. But it ended up being 3,000 total miles in 1 year. And that's not the first wolf we've seen that with. We've had several wolves that have made big long distance dispersals like that. They do have a wide diet, mainly elk, and that's what we see most of their diet being as elk. And we saw that with the reintroduction in the northern range when we saw that elk reduction up there. They do hunt moose quite a bit. In the winter, mule deer becomes a big staple for them. There was one pack in the park that began to specialize on bison, the Molly pack, and I think it was upwards of like 30% of their diet had become bison, although that pack has begun to disperse down now. And then a lot of just incidental rodents and whatever they can get their mouths on throughout the year. The wolf management requirements for Wyoming. So when wolves were delisted, we agreed to certain requirements to keep them on the landscape and to keep them from being relisted in the future. That was mainly 10 breeding pairs, and breeding pair means one male and one female with 2 pups that survive to the end of the calendar year. And then at least 100 wolves at the end of the calendar year. Plus, we agreed to a numerical buffer above that. And that numerical buffer was 15 breeding pairs and 150 wolves within Wyoming. But we were able to include Yellowstone National Park and Wind River Reservation as part of that buffer. We also had to agree to adequate regulatory mechanisms to make sure that the wolf population met or exceeded those delisting criteria within that breeding pair and population levels. And then we also had to document genetic interchange between wolf subpopulations within the Rocky Mountains. So that's Montana and Idaho, basically. Or if we do get wolves from Oregon and Washington, that would count as well. And that's pretty safe, as you guys saw from that wolf that moved between the 4 states or 5 states. Yeah, we document that quite a bit. If we look at last year's wolf population, this is where we shaped up last year. The state total was 311 wolves with 43 packs and 22 breeding pairs. Outside of the park, Yellowstone National Park, and the reservation, we had 201 wolves, 32 packs, and 14 breeding pairs. If we look just within the Cody region, we had 69 wolves, 13 packs, and 5 breeding pairs. And I should mention, these are all just known minimums. We know we have more wolves out there, but wolves are actually really easy to count because of that pack structure and their territorial nature. Given a year, we can get probably 95% of them found out there. It's those singles and there's those lone pairs that usually evade us and may not get detected. If we look at that population over time from 2000 to 2019, this line represents our buffer, our minimum buffer, and we've exceeded that since 2005. You see these high points here and here. That's actually both times that wolves were, this is when they came off the list. The first time you saw the population drop as state management took over. And then they were relisted and we saw them spike again. And then in 2017 coming off the list, and we began to manage them back down to lower levels again. If we look at it with breeding pairs, we've exceeded breeding pairs since about 2006. We've gotten a little bit down to the line the last couple of years, but through state management, I don't see that we're going to try and manage them for these upper levels again. So when it comes to conflict with wolves or interaction with wolves, really most human interaction is pretty good. They're not a real aggressive species. We don't see a lot of hardly any, I guess, human interaction that turns into an aggressive conflict with wolves. But the conflict mainly comes with livestock. And I don't know that was a surprise to anybody when they first got introduced. If we look at the long-term effect of having wolves with livestock from 2000 to 2019, you see that this is the population within the black line. We had a few years of spikes with cattle depredation, mainly around 2006 and 2016. That 2016 spike corresponded with the relisting of wolves within the state. And as a result of that, the federal government actually responded and removed several wolves. So you see that population start to drop again in 2017-18, but so did cattle depredations and sheep depredations. But you look again to like 2018-19 when we took over, as a result of that, we actually didn't have to remove that many wolves. We've been able to keep the population low enough that conflict stayed low as well. Part of the conflict management within the state of Wyoming is we do pay compensation for livestock to producers, not just for wolves, but for all large carnivores. And last year, the Game and Fish Department, we paid about $106,000 to compensate 19 different producers for livestock that were killed or injured. And that's within the trophy game area. And that in Wyoming, we have a dual management scheme with wolves. Within the northwest corner of the state, they are managed by the state as a trophy game animal. And the rest of the state, the rest of the 80% of the state, that is, they're considered a predator that can be hunted year round without a license. And so we do not pay compensation in that predator zone. Compensation payments have declined. So you see that high in 2017 or 2016, excuse me, that was a little over $400,000. And that was during while they were listed on the Endangered Species Act, down to now in 2019, where we're at about 106,000 again. So a little bit of wolf-human interaction. And like I said, this is pretty rare. We just almost never hear of it, but it is something worth noting. And it does, as I talk through this, I want you to think about applying it to a predatory attack with a grizzly bear or an attack with a black bear or a mountain lion as well, because all of that comes together in what I'm about to go over here. So we look at wolf encounters in North America, and I think this was from the turn of the century through 2002. Alaska classified what they thought were different aggressive behaviors and attacks through time, or at least through the last century. And if we look at that through these categories, we have anger and anxiety behavior. So that's probably that aggressive defensive, although you'd still want to, we'll go over how you still would want to react with that. Self-defense, rabies, there's 12 cases of rabies in the last century in wolves. Prey testing, so they're basically looking at you as prey and trying to figure out if you actually are prey. And then actual predation, there was 3 cases, and there has been a couple cases since this study was put out. So if we want to avoid wolf encounter while we're hiking or camping, the biggest thing you can do is keep a clean camp. And honestly, we should probably be keeping a clean camp anyway. Keep your food away from camp or hung up where it's unavailable to not only wolves, but bears as well. Big thing is controlling your dogs. Don't approach or provoke a wolf. If you see one in the wild, just let them do their thing. They'll generally move off on their own. Again, carry bear spray or really any defense to have with you just in case. Never feed a wolf, although I want to throw in that probably don't feed any wildlife. It never ends up good for wildlife that gets fed. And monitor children closely, and that's just because they're smaller stature, and in a lot of attack cases, it ends up being smaller statured people that are the attack victims. Again, wolves and dogs really don't mix. Wolves actively defend a territory from other wolves and from other canids. And so, especially during that denning season or when they have pups and rendezvous sites, they can get very aggressive and very defensive near those pups. And it's hard to know, unless you're looking for wolf sign in a meadow or wherever you're camping, if they're going to be close by or not. So you want to keep them close whenever you're recreating in wolf country. If you do encounter one at close range, the biggest thing is don't panic. It's just the worst thing you could do with any large carnivore. You do want to assess their behavior. So same as you would with bears. Are they really keenly interested on you? Have they been following you for a long time? Are they approaching you very closely? Are they acting like they're very curious about you? That's probably not things you want them doing. The biggest thing you can do is show them that you're not a prey item. And so you want to make yourself look big, make a lot of noise, keep that animal in front of you. Do never turn your back to it, and back away as you can. The biggest thing is don't run. And that's because that can trigger that predatory instinct in them, and that'll cause a chase to follow. Again, look big, stand your ground, make noise. You want to be really aggressive. You want to fight back. And this is with every encounter with a wolf. They don't really have an aggressive defensive behavior. Well, they'll leave you alone. So you just want to fight back. Use things such as rocks, stones, anything you can get your hands on, or bear spray or firearm if you have those available to you. So to kind of wrap that up, there are challenges with having large carnivores on the landscape, and especially bears and wolves. And I think anybody that lives with them knows that, and we're trying to figure out how to go about that. One of the big things is non-securable attractants, and so that could be something such as a cattle herd on a landscape, or a cornfield, or really any of these agricultural products that we're seeing bears or any large carnivore expand into now. Public mindset and tolerance is laws and regulations hinder what we can do management wise. We see mindsets and tolerance starting to wane, and that's a challenge for us to figure out how to keep those tolerances high and to maintain a positive attitude for having these animals on the landscape. And then of course securing funding. I mean, all the public agencies now are under strict funding and a lot of budget cuts. So where do we find our money now when we're getting cut? We always want to maintain our vigilance, and with us, it's a lot of maintaining immediate response to conflicts. We want to make sure we're able to help you folks, and for you folks to be able to help each other too. And we want to continue to find preemptive solutions for conflict resolution, whether that's building electric fence or helping you secure your grain shed, or make sure that we're making those animals think that subdivision's a bad place to be. It's all things that we think about every day. We want to continue to work closely with you guys as Wyoming stakeholders, because honestly, that's the reason we're here. And then continue outreach and education, because that's the biggest way we can get the message out. So I guess with that, I'll kind of wrap it up. And these websites at the bottom are great places to find more information. Our Game and Fish website, if you click on the Wyoming Wildlife tab, more wildlife, and then the large carnivore tab, there's all the information that you can want in there. And then the interagency grizzly bear study team out of Bozeman is, man, it's just a world of knowledge for bears up there. So, yeah.
We've got a lot of questions. So the first one is the Grizzlies were listed in 1975. When did Wyoming Game and Fish stop issuing licenses?
It was about 1970, I believe. It was a few years before the delisting, or before the listing, I should say. So yeah, they hunted them through the 60s. And actually in the early days, you could actually get a bear license with your elk tag. And that's how most people hunted them. But yeah, by 1970, that was shut down.
And then could you tell us about the grizzly trapping that's going on through mid-October in Yellowstone? Is this bear counting program also being implemented in the Shoshone National Forest right now?
Not to my knowledge in the forest, although it has been in the past. So that's coming through the interagency grizzly bear study team, and that's a division of the USGS that's based out of Bozeman, and they circle the whole ecosystem, trapping between the park system and the states. And we actually, the Wyoming Game and Fish, we have a team that does that in conjunction with them, and it is to maintain a subset of collars, basically to monitor the population is what's going on there.
And then I'll start with the first one. Is there another more recent caloric value category study to see if food type and caloric value has changed over time?
Not to my knowledge. That the last one I know about, and actually, if you look at that, I hate to go back to that interagency grizzly bear site. That's where they house most of that information. And so all of the studies that come out of them or other people are housed there. And that would be the best resource to look. And then most of that's coming out of past research that's done, but not to my knowledge has something been done recently.
Okay. And then what is the territorial range of an individual grizzly bear?
Man, it varies a lot. Some of the males will go 200 to 300 square miles, and they'll range quite a bit. We have some males that circle the whole ecosystem. You know, if you look at females, it's quite a bit smaller. 50 to 100 square miles, and that really depends on whether they have cubs at side too. If they have little cubs, they really don't range that far.
Okay, and what about the social threshold of a home range?
Man, that's a tough one. You look at grizzly bears and they allow other bears pretty dang close. You look at a moss site, for instance, you look at the spine of Carter Mountain and you'll have 3 to 4 females with cubs within 20 yards of each other, along with 3 or 4 adult males. And so if the food source is there, they'll tolerate the others being there really well. If they're very food stressed, then it widens a lot. It just, one male will dominate a whole pine patch if that's all he has to eat, and he won't let anything in there. If there's a lot to eat, he'll let others in there. So it really varies. I guess that's a hard question to answer.
And has there been any studies on Wyoming bears or Greater Yellowstone ecosystem bears that track den sites and when bears emerge from the den? Curious at how bears are adapting or not adapting to seasonal changes.
Yeah, there is some. I don't know that anybody's really quantified it into a research paper yet, but we haven't seen a ton of change since I've been around. Most males or big adult males are coming out in mid to late March, and that's been pretty typical for a long time. You see females, or especially females with cubs, that's late April, early May. And that's, you do get a few of them that'll come out in early April, but for the most part, they stay in a long time, and that hasn't been changing that I've seen.
And sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
So this one's kind of long. They say, could you address the ongoing use of what this person believes to be a lobbied population number? It's my opinion that grizzly bear numbers that are widely used as grizzly population numbers are based on political posturizing, either to avoid conflict or create conflict. When will we be able to use real numbers and real science to address the exploding population of grizzly bear?
Yeah, no, that is a tough one. But no, I don't believe that it is political, the number at all. So the problem lies within finding a statistically suitable model within to find them. And we know that model is biased extremely low, but we also have to be able to show that there's a statistically valid model to count them too. And to get that through peer review is a pretty hard process. And we are working on that. And that is something that's being done right now and is very close to being set up. You look at the guys that are behind that right now, and they're the most unbiased people I've ever met in my life. And they're some of the best scientists I've ever met in my life. And I don't believe that any of them are politically driven through it. And I don't know that any of us in the business are in it to be politically driven by it. It just is what it is. We're using the science that we have. It's the best available science we have. We know it's biased and it's off, but we're working on that. And that's really all we can do. So,
does that have, do the map with the two different ranges, does that play into that at all?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, you look at bears outside of that demographic monitoring area, we know there's a bunch of them there that aren't getting counted, and they never will get counted. And for me, as much as I hate to say it, it's a double-edged sword, because I do wish they were counted. However, it gives me much more leeway to deal with them in management situations too. I basically have an open book for management, where it was within that demographic monitoring area or within the primary conservation area. I don't have that. And so if you have a bear in your trash and you live east of Highway 120, we're probably going to remove that bear. Where if you were in Crandall, there's a good chance we probably wouldn't remove that bear. And so, yeah, it plays into different facets all over management that way.
And what are ranches doing, or what have you implemented to reduce livestock issues?
Man, we've tried everything. We've tried flaggery, we've tried lights, we've tried riding more. A lot of the guys that are really successful keeping carnivores out of livestock, it's basically boiled down to human presence. Is if you can afford to keep range riders, or not even range riders, but if you can keep your cowboys circulating through that livestock quite a bit, it seems to make the biggest difference. Honestly, with wolves, they get used to everything really fast. And beyond removing wolves that are causing livestock depredations, there's not a whole lot out there. We can keep them out for a certain amount of time, but they get used to almost everything we throw at them. And so that's still in the works on how we're going to deal with that beyond lethal removals. And it's just the way it is right now.
And what was the elk reduction you mentioned? Was that due to wolves and hunting, or what is the population for the elk population objective for that area?
Well, it's all over the board. So yeah, I was referencing the northern Yellowstone herd, which was at about like right around 20,000 animals in the mid 90s at the boom. And that a lot of that came after the 88 fires, and we saw elk populations really explode throughout the ecosystem. And by 95, we were at pretty much all-time highs. And I think that was probably part of the reason the park looked at bringing wolves in, is they were just nuking that northern end of the park. I think if a rancher was hitting their range that hard, they would have got talked to long before Yellowstone had to deal with it. But so that population of elk now is about 4,000 to 5,000 animals. So we saw pretty much a 75% decrease in that population. You look around Wyoming, and even within the Yellowstone ecosystem, it's all over the board. Most of our populations are at or just under population objectives, although you look at like the Grable River, and it's actually way above population objectives right now. So it's kind of all over the board. It's hard to put one herd into, or put it all into one herd.
And then how much comes from the non-consumptive land user, and do you have anything specifically set up for that constituent?
As far as conflict?
I think so. That's
yeah, we try, and we've branched out our educational efforts to a lot of non-consumptive users. We started using like mountain bikers. We're reaching out to mountain bikers as they're a growing population. We're trying to get in with some of the hiking clubs. We've done presentations in conjunction with the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, trying to get to some of that focus group. And so we are trying to focus some education that way. One of our main conflict areas right now that I'm actually actively trying to figure out how to deal with conflicts there is the Beartooth Mountains. And so that's a big non-consumptive portion of the US population that's coming there. Although they're transient coming through there, we see a lot of food conditioned bears starting to appear out of there. And that's been a big struggle for not only us, but Montana as well. And how do we get the message out to people that have never heard the message or may just walk right past it if we put a sign up? And so it's definitely something that's on our mind.
Do you think Wyoming has an ethical and scientific wolf management plan or just a political vendetta one?
well, it's a little bit loaded, but no, I think where we manage them, we definitely do it with science. But we also all wildlife management is political. There's not an ounce of it that isn't. It's driven by politics and economics. And so, yeah, I mean, you look at the only reason we have a predatory zone is because a lot of the agricultural community was asking for that when we were starting to set up our regulations. And so instead of having wolves as a trophy game species statewide, we allowed it to be predatory zone in the majority of the state in order for those guys to be able to handle problems on their own. And that was due to a lot of pressure from the political community. You look at the way we set quotas now, it comes from a lot of public input. So that's coming from deer and elk hunters, ranchers, and of course, people that don't want to have wolves killed either. But I mean, everything in wildlife management is basically politically driven if you boil right down to it.
And on the landscape, what's the not turnover, but the difference between are grizzlies dying of natural causes primarily, or old age, or are they having to be removed from the landscape?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And that's kind of changed over time too. So we've seen as the population has gone up, cub survival has actually gone down, and that's due to adult male survival actually hanging around 95%. And so we see a lot of males are actually probably preying upon cubs. And that's where you see probably your biggest natural source of mortality. Within adults, probably the biggest source of mortality is management removals that we know of. But that being said, we don't find a lot of dead grizzly bears either. So if they're dying in the den, we don't find them. If they're nutritionally stressed and die somewhere, we may not find them for several years. And so what we see on a year-to-year basis, what we're finding is probably most of those are management removals. And those are listed on that interagency grizzly bear study team site. If you go there, it lists every mortality for every year on there. So there's actually one for 2020 on there now that has every known mortality there and that cause of mortality. So you can look at that there.
Awesome. Great. I think that's all of our questions. So thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. This was great.
Absolutely. And if people have other questions, how can they get in touch with you?
You can call the Cody Regional Office here at 307-527-7125 and leave a message here and I'll be sure to get back to you. Oh.
Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Yeah, thank you guys.